The Outline of History, being a plain history of life and mankind by H.G. Wells, revised and brought up to the end of the Second World War by Raymond Postgate, with maps and plans by J.F. Horben, Volume 1, Book 4, Chapter 22, The Career of Alexander the Great, Section 1, Philippe of Macedonia, Section 2, The Murder of King Philippe, Section 3, Alexander's First Conquests, Section 4, The Wanderings of Alexander, Section 5, Was Alexander Indeed Great, Section 6, The Successors of Alexander, Section 7, Pergamum, a Refuge of Culture, Section 8, Alexander as a Portent of World Unity, Section 1, The true hero of the story of Alexander is not so much Alexander as his father, Philip. The author of a piece does not shine in the limelight as the actor does, and it was Philip who planned much of the greatness that his son achieved, who laid the foundations and forged the tools, who had indeed already begun the Persian expedition at the time of his death. Philip, beyond doubting, was one of the greatest monarchs the world has ever seen. He was a man of the utmost intelligence and ability, and his range of ideas was vastly beyond the scope of his time. He made Aristotle his friend. He must have discussed with him those schemes for the organization of real knowledge, which the philosopher was to realize later through Alexander's endowment. Philip, so far as we can judge, seems to have been Aristotle's prince. To him, Aristotle turned as men turn only to those whom they admire and trust. Philip, also to Socrates, appealed as the great leader who should unify into the noble, patriotic public life of Greece. In many books it is stated that Philip was a man of incredible cynicism and of uncontrolled lust. It is true that at feasts, like all the Macedonians of his time, he was a hard drinker and sometimes drunken. It was probably considered unamiable not to drink excessively at feasts. But of the other accusations there is no real proof, and for evidence we have only the railings of such antagonists as Demosthenes, the Athenian demagogue and orator, a man of reckless rhetoric. The quotation of a phrase or so will serve to show to what the patriotic anger of Demosthenes could bring him. In one of the Philippics, as his denunciations of Philip are called, he gives vent in this style. And before we get to that, we have Philip of Macedon. Philip, a man who not only is no Greek, and no way akin to the Greeks, but is not even a barbarian from a respectable country. No, a pestilent fellow, a Macedon, a hunter, from which we never get even a decent slave, and so on and so on. We know as a matter of fact that Macedonians were an Aryan people, very closely akin to the Greeks, and that Philip was probably the best educated man of his time. This was the spirit in which the diverse accounts of Philip were written. When Philip became king of Macedonia in 359 BCE, his country was a little country without either a seaport or any considerable city. It had a peasant population, Greek almost in language, and ready to be Greek in sympathies, but more purely Nordic in blood than any people to the south of it. Philip, in just a little barbaric state into a great one, he created the most efficient military organization the world had so far seen, and he had brought most of Greece into one confederacy under his leadership at the time of his death, and his extraordinary quality, his power of thinking out beyond the current ideas of his time, is shown not so much in those matters as in the care with which he had his son trained to carry on the policy he had created. He is one of the few monarchs in history who cared for his successor. Alexander was, as few other monarchs have ever been, a king specially educated for empire. Aristotle was but one of the several able tutors his father chose for him. Philip confided his policy to him and entrusted him with commands and authority at the time he was 16. He commanded the cavalry at Paraneia, under his father's eye, he was nursed into power generously and unsuspiciously. To anyone who reads his life with care, it is evident that Alexander started with an equipment of training and ideas of unprecedented value. As he got beyond the wisdom of his upbringing, he began to blunder and misbehave, sometimes with a dreadful folly. The defects of his character had triumphed over his upbringing long before he died. Philip was a king after the old pattern, a leader king, first among his peers of the ancient Nordic Aryan type. The army he found in Macedonia consisted of a general foot levy and a noble equestrian order called the Companions. The people were farmers and hunters, and somewhat drunken in their habits, but ready for discipline and good fighting stuff. And if the people were homely, the government was intelligent and alert. For some generations, the court language had been Attic, Athenian, Greek, and the court had been sufficiently civilized to shelter and entertain such great figures as Euripides, who died there in 406 BCE, and Zeuxis, the artist. Moreover, Philip, before his accession, had spent some years as a hostage in Greece. He had as good an education as Greece could give at that time. He was therefore quite familiar with what we may call the idea of esocrates, the idea of a great union of the Greek states in Europe to dominate the Eastern world. And he knew too how incapable was the Athenian democracy, because of its constitution and tradition, of taking opportunity that lay before it. For it was an opportunity that would have to be shared. If the Athenians are the Spartans, it would mean letting in a lot of foreigners, give advantages of citizenship. It would mean lowering themselves to the level of equality and fellowship with the Macedonians, a people from whom we do not even get a decent slave. There was no way to secure anonymity among the Greeks for the contemplated enterprise except by some revolutionary political action. It was no love of peace that kept the Greeks from such an adventure. It was their political divisions. The resources of the several states were exhausted in a series of internecine wars, arising out of the merest excuses and fanned by oratorical wind. The plowing of certain sacred lands near Delphi by the Phocians was, for example, the pretext for a sanguinary sacred war. Philip's first years of kingship were devoted to the discipline of his army. Hitherto, most of the main battle fighting in the world had been done by footmen in formation. And here we have a map of the growth of the Macedonia under Philip, king of Macedonia, of Philip's succession and at his death. So, considerable growth, obviously. In the very ancient Sumerian battle pieces, we see spearmen in close order forming the main battle, just as they did in the Zulu armies of the 19th century. The Greek troops of Philip's time were still fighting in that same style. The Theban phalanx was a mass of infantry holding spears, the hinder ranks thrusting their longer spears between the frontline men. Such a formation went through anything less disciplined that opposed it. Mounted archers could, of course, inflict considerable losses on such a mass of men, and accordingly, as the horse came into warfare, horsemen appeared on either side as an accessory to this main battle. The reader must remember that the horse did not come into very effective use in Western war until the rise of the Assyrians, and then at first only as a war chariot. The chariots drove full tilt at the infantry mass and tried to break it. Unless its discipline was very solid, they succeeded. The Homeric fighting is chariot fighting. It is not until the last 1,000 years BCE that we begin to find mounted soldiers as distinct from charioteers playing a part in warfare. At first they appear to have fought in a scattered fashion, each man doing his personal feats. So the Lydians fought against Cyrus. It was Philip who seems to have created charging cavalry. He ordered his companions to drill for a massed charge, and also he strengthened his phalanx by giving the rear men longer spears than had been used hitherto, and so deepening its mass. The Macedonian phalanx was merely a more solid version of the Theban phalanx. None of these massed infantry formations were flexible enough to stand a flank or rear attack. They had very slight maneuvering power. Both Philip's and his son's victories followed, therefore with variegations. One general scheme of cooperation between these two arms, the phalanx advanced in the center and held the enemy's main body. On one wing or the other, the cavalry charges swept away the enemy's cavalry, and then swooped round upon the flank and rear of the enemy phalanx, the front of which the Macedonian phalanx was already smiting. The enemy main battle then broke and was massacred. As Alexander's military experience grew, he also added the use of catapults in the field, big stone-throwing affairs, to break up the enemy infantry. Before his time, catapults had been used in sieges, but never in battles. He invented artillery preparations. With the weapon of his new army in his hand, Philip first turned his attention to the north of Macedonia. He carried expeditions into Illyria and as far as the Danube. He also spread his power along the coast as far as the Hellespont. He secured possession of a port, Amphipolis, and certain gold mines adjacent. After several Thracian expeditions, he turned southward. In good earnest, he took up the cause of the Delphic Amphictyoni against those sacrilegious Phocians, and so appeared as the champion of the Hellenic religion. There was a strong party of Greeks, it must be understood, a pan-Hellenic party in favor of the Greek leadership of Philip. The chief writer of this pan-Hellenic movement was Isocrates. Athens, on the other hand, was the head and front of the opposition to Philip, and Athens was in open sympathy with Persia, even sending emissaries to the great king to warn him of the danger to him of a united Greece. The comings and goings of 12 years cannot be related here. In 338 BCE, the long struggle between division and pan-Hellenism came to a decisive issue. And at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip inflicted a crushing defeat upon Athens and her allies. He gave Athens peace upon astonishingly generous terms. He displayed himself steadfastly, resolved to propitiate and favor that implacable city, and in 338 BCE, a congress of Greek states recognized him as the captain general for the war against Persia. He was now a man of 47. It seemed as though the world lay at his feet. He had made his little country into the leading state in a great Greco-Macedonian confederacy. That unification was to be the prelude to a still greater one, the unification of the Western world with the Persian Empire into one world state of all known peoples. Who can doubt that he had the dream? The writings of Isocrates convinced us that he had it. Who can deny that he might have realized it? He had a reasonable hope of living for perhaps another quarter century of activity. In 336 BCE, his advance guard crossed into Asia, but he never followed with his main forces. He was assassinated. From Pella, we have this bas-relief of a Macedonian warrior. Dude needs to wear some clothes, because obviously clothes, protect you a little bit when it comes to the battle. 2. It is necessary now to tell something of the domestic life of King Philip. The lives of both Philip and his son were pervaded by the personality of a restless and evil woman, Olympias, the mother of Alexander. I don't remember the Greek spelling, so I'm just doing my best to make it sound right. She was the daughter of the king of Epirus, a country to the west of Macedonia. Unlike Macedonia, a semi-Greek land, she met Philip, or was thrown in his way at some religious gathering in Samothrace. Plutarch declares the marriage was a love match, and there seems to be at least this much in the charges against Philip that, like many energetic and imaginative men, he was prone to impatient love impulses. He married her when he was already a king, and Alexander was born to him 3 years later. It was not long before Olympias and Philip were bitterly estranged. She was jealous of him, but there was another and graver source of trouble in her passion for religious mysteries. We have already noted that beneath the fine and restrained Nordic religion of the Greeks, the land abounded with religious cults of a darker and more ancient kind, aboriginal cults, with secret initiations, orgiastic celebrations, and often with cruel and obscene rites. These religions of the shadows, these practices of the women and peasants and slaves, gave Greece her Orphic, Dionysic, and Demeter cults. They have lurked in the tradition of Europe down almost to our own times. The witchcraft of the Middle Ages, with its resort to the blood of babes, which turned out to almost never be a true thing, but scraps of executed criminals, incantations, and magic circles, seems to have been little else than the lingering vestiges of these solemnities of the dark whites. In these matters, Olympias was an expert and enthusiast, and Plutarch mentions that she achieved some considerable celebrity by a use of tame serpents in these pious exercises. The snakes invaded her domestic apartments, and history is not clear whether Philip found in them matter for exasperation or religious awe. Yeah, it just all depends on the woman yielding it right, for the most part. You know, I knew a woman who had a big old snake. What was the thing? A boa. These occupations of his wife must have been a serious inconvenience to Philip, for the Macedonian people were still in that sturdy stage of social development in which neither enthusiastic religiosity nor uncontrollable wives are admired. The evidence of bitter hostility between mother and father peeps out in many little things in the histories. She was evidently jealous of Philip's conquests. She hated his fame. There are many signs that Olympias did her best to set her son against his father and attach him wholly to herself. A story survives in Plutarch's life that whenever news was brought of Philip's victories, the capture of a city, or the winning of some great battle, he never seemed greatly rejoiced to hear it. On the contrary, he used to say to his playfellows, "Father will get everything in advance. Boys, he won't leave any great task for me to share with you." It is not a natural thing for a boy to envy his father in this fashion without some inspiration. That sentence sounds like an echo. We have already pointed out how manifest it is that Philip planned the succession of Alexander, and how eager he was to thrust fame and power into the boy's hands. He was thinking of the political structure he was building, but the mother was thinking of the glory and pride of that wonderful lady, Olympias. She marked her hatred of her husband under the cloak of a mother's solicitude for her son's future, when in 337 BCE, Philip, after the fashion of kings in those days, married a second wife, who was a native Macedonian, Cleopatra. The ancient Egyptian has a Q and a D instead of a C and a T, of whom he was passionately enamored. Olympias made much trouble. Plutarch tells of a pitiful scene that occurred at Philip's marriage to Cleopatra. There was much drinking of wine at the banquet, and Attalus, the father of the bride, being intoxicated with liquor, betrayed the general hostility to Olympias and Epirus by saying he hoped there would be a child by the marriage to give them a truly Macedonian heir, whereupon Alexander, taught for such an insult, cried out, "What then am I?" and hurled his cup at Attalus. Philip, enraged, stood up and said. Plutarch drew his sword, only to stumble and fall. Alexander, blind with rage and jealousy, taunted and insulted his father. "Macedonians," he said, "see there the general who would go from Europe to Asia, why he cannot get from one table to another. How that scene lives still. The sprawled, the flushed faces, the angry voice of the boy. Next day, Alexander, departed with his mother, and Philip did nothing to restrain them. Olympias went home to Epirus. Alexander departed to Illyria. Thence Philip persuaded him to return. Fresh trouble arose. Alexander had a brother of weak intellect, Aridaeus, whom the Persian governor of Caria sought as a son-in-law. Alexander's friends and his mother now infused notions into him again, though perfectly groundless, that by so noble a match and the support consequent upon it, Philip designated the crown for Aridaeus. Alexander, in the uneasiness of these suspicions, sent one Thessalus, a player, into Caria to desire the grandee to pass by Aridaeus, who was of spurious birth and deficient in point of understanding, and to take the lawful heir to the crown into his alliance. Pixodarus was infinitely more pleased with this proposal, but Philip no sooner had intelligence of it than he went to Alexander's apartment, taking along with him Philotas, the son of Parmenio, one of his most intimate friends and companions, and in his presence reproached him with his degeneracy and meanness of spirit in thinking of being son-in-law to a man of Caria, one of the slaves of a barbarian king. At the same time, he wrote to the Corinthians, insisting that they should send Thessalus to him in chains, for Paul and Arcus, Phrygius, and Ptolemy, some of the other companions of the prince, he banished. But Alexander afterwards recalled them and treated them with great distinction. There is something very touching in this story of a father pleading with the son he manifestly loved, and baffled by the web of mean suggestion which had been spun about the boy's imagination. It was at the marriage of his daughter to her uncle, the king of Epirus, and the brother of Olympias, that Philip was stabbed. He was walking in a procession into the theater, unarmed, in a white robe, and he was cut down by one of his bodyguard. The murderer had a horse waiting, and would have gotten away, but the foot of his horse caught in a wild vine, and he was thrown from the saddle by the stumble and slain by his pursuers. And probably less talked about is it could have been the daughter didn't want to be forced to marry her uncle. As much as that might be the culture, people kind of revolt against that sort of thing naturally. So, at the age of 20, Alexander was at the end of his anxiety about the succession and established king in Macedonia. Olympias then reappeared in Macedonia, a woman proudly vindicated. It is said that she insisted upon paying the same funeral honors to the memory of the murderer as to Philip. In Greece, there was great rejoicings over this auspicious event, and Demosthenes, when he had the news, although it was but 7 days after the death of his own daughter, went into the public assembly at Athens in gay attire, wearing a chaplet, so, joyous or flamboyant or whatever. Well, joyous, more direct translation, but, probably something flowery, you could say. Ruffles and ridges and all that. Whatever Olympias may have done about her husband's assassination, history does not doubt about her treatment of her supplanter, Cleopatra. So soon as Alexander was out of the way, and a revolt of the hillmen in the north called at once for his attention. Cleopatra's newly born child was killed in its mother's arms, and Cleopatra, no doubt, after a little taunting, was then strangled. These excesses of womanly feeling are said to have shocked Alexander, but they did not prevent him from leaving his mother in a position of considerable authority in Macedonia. She wrote letters to him upon religious and political questions, and he showed a dutiful disposition in sending her always a large share of the plunder he made. Yeah, you provide for your mother from what you can. And it helps to try to get permission from the fellow wives, and when you're getting more wives, and to help them to get along, because if you just let this stuff fester, it's going to cause problems. Now, I don't know if anybody hearing this is ever going to have multiple wives, but, you know, Section 3, these stories have to be told because history cannot be understood without them. Here was the great world of men between India and the Adriatic, ready for union, ready as it had never been before, a unifying control. Here was the wide order of the Persian Empire with its roads, its posts, its general peace and prosperity, ripe for the fertilizing influence of the Greek mind, and these stories display the quality of the human beings to whom these great opportunities came. Here was this Philip, who was a very great and noble man, and yet he was drunken. He could keep no order in his household. Here was Alexander, in many ways gifted above any man of his time, and he was vain, suspicious, and passionate, with a mindset Ari by his mother. We are beginning to understand something of what the world might be, something of what our race might become, were it not for our still raw humanity. It is barely a matter of 70 generations between ourselves and Alexander, and between ourselves and the savage hunters, our ancestors, who charred their food in the embers or ate it raw. Intervened some 400 or 500 generations. There is not much scope for the modification of a species of 400 or 500 generations. Make men and women only sufficiently jealous, or fearful, or drunken, or angry, and the hot red eyes of the caveman will glare out at us today. We have writing and teaching, science and power. We have tamed the beast and schooled the lightning, but we are still only shambling towards the light. We have tamed and bred the beast, but we have still to tame and breed ourselves. From the very beginning of his reign, deeds of Alexander showed how well he had assimilated his father's plans and how great were his own abilities. A map of the known world is needed to show the course of his life. At first, after receiving assurances from Greece that he was to be captain general of the Grecian forces, he marched through Thrace to the Danube. He crossed the river and burnt a village, the second great monarch to raid the Scythian country and the Hyperboreans beyond the Danube, and then recrossed it and marched westward, and so came down by Illyria. By that time, the city of Thebes was in rebellion, and its next blow was at Greece. Thebes, unsupported, of course, by Athens, was taken and looted. It was treated with extravagant violence. All its buildings, except the temple and the house of the poet Pindar, were razed, and 30,000 people sold into slavery. Greece was stunned, and Alexander was free to go on with the Persian campaign. This destruction of Thebes betrayed a streak of violence in the new master of human destinies. It was too heavy a blow to have dealt. It was a barbaric thing to do. If the spirit of rebellion was killed, so also was the spirit of help. The Greek states remained inert thereafter, neither troublesome nor helpful. They would not support Alexander with their shipping, a thing which was to prove a very grave embarrassment to him. There is a story told by Plutarch about this Theban massacre, as if it redounded to the credit of Alexander, but indeed it shows only how his saner and his crazy sides were in conflict. It tells of a Macedonian officer and a Theban lady. This officer was among the looters, and he entered this woman's house, inflicted unspeakable insults and injuries upon her, and at last demanded whether she had gold or silver hidden. She told him all her treasures had been put into the well, conducted him thither, and as he stooped to peer down, pushed him suddenly in and killed him by throwing great stones upon him. Some allied soldiers came upon this scene and took her forthwith to Alexander for judgment. She defied him. Already the extravagant impulse that had ordered the massacre was upon the wane, and he not only spared her, but had her family and property and freedom restored to her. This Plutarch makes out to be a generosity, but the issue is more complicated than that. It was Alexander who was outraging and plundering and enslaving all Thebes. That poor crumpled Macedonian brute in the well had been doing only what he had been told he had full liberty to do. Is a commander first to give cruel orders, and then to forgive and reward those who slay his instruments. This gleam of remorse at the instance of one woman, who is not perhaps wanting in tragic dignity and beauty, is a poor set-off to the murder of a great city. Mixed with the craziness of Olympias and Alexander were the sanity of Philip and the teaching of Aristotle. The Theban business certainly troubled the minds of the mind of Alexander. Whenever afterward he encountered Thebans, he tried to show them special favor. Thebes, to his credit, haunted him. Yet the memory of Thebes did not save 3 other great cities from similar brainstorms. Tyre he destroyed, and Gaza, and a city in India, in the storming of which he was knocked down in fair fight and wounded, and of the latter place not a soul, not a child was spared. Well, he kind of should spare some people here and there, but he must have been badly frightened to have taken so evil a revenge. Well, at least dude's admitting that it's an evil revenge to kill the children that are captive too. At the outset of the war, the Persians had the supreme advantage. They were practically masters of the sea. The ships of the Athenians and their allies sulked unhelpfully. Alexander, to get at Asia, had to go round by the Hellespont, and if he pushed far into the Persian Empire, he ran the risk of being cut off completely from his base. His first task, therefore, was to cripple the enemy at sea, and this he could do only by marching along the coast of Asia Minor and capturing port after port until the Persian sea bases were destroyed. If the Persians had avoided battle and hung upon his lengthening line of communications, they could probably have destroyed him, but this they did not do. The Persian army, not very much greater than his own, gave battle on the banks of the Granicus, 334 BCE, and was destroyed. Lys left them free to take Sardis, Ephesus, Miletus, and after a fierce struggle, Halicarnassus. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet was on his right, and between him and Greece, threatening much, but accomplishing nothing. In 333 BCE, pursuing this attack upon the sea bases, he marched along the coast as far as the head of the Gulf, now called the Gulf of Alexandretta. A huge Persian army under the great king Darius III was inland of his line of march, separated from the coast by mountains, and Alexander went right beyond this enemy force before he or the Persians realized their proximity. Scouting was evidently very badly done by Greek and Persian alike. The Persian army was a vast, ill-organized assembly of soldiers, transport, camp followers, and so forth. Darius, for instance, was accompanied by his harem, and there was a great multitude of harem slaves, musicians, dancers, and cooks. Many of the leading officers had brought their families to witness the hunting down of the Macedonian invaders. The troops had been levied from every province in the empire. They had no tradition or principle of combined action. Seized by the idea of cutting off Alexander from Greece, Darius moved this multitude over the mountains to the sea. He had the luck to get through the passes without opposition, and he encamped on the plain of Issus between the mountains and the shore. And there Alexander, who had turned back to fight, struck him. The cavalry charged, and the phalanx smashed this great brittle host as a stone smashes a bottle. It was routed. Darius escaped from his war chariot, that out-of-date instrument, and fled on horseback, leaving even his harem in the hands of Alexander. All the accounts of Alexander after this battle show him at his best. He was restrained and magnanimous. He treated the Persian princess with the utmost civility, and he kept his head. He held steadfastly to his plan. He let Darius escape unpursued into Syria, and he continued his march upon the naval bases of the Persians, that is to say, upon the Phoenician ports of Tyre and Sidon. Sidon surrendered to him, and Tyre resisted. And campaign, an empire of Alexander the Great. So Alexander is going to march, and the empire of Alexander here, if anywhere, we have evidence of great military ability on the part of Alexander. His army was his father's creation, but Philip had never shown in the siege of cities. When Alexander was a boy of 16, he had seen his father repulsed by the fortified city of Byzantium upon the Bosphorus. Now he was face to face with an inviolate city, which had stood siege after siege, which had resisted Nebuchadnezzar the Great for 14 years. For the standing of sieges, Semitic peoples hold the palm. Tyre was then an island half a mile from the shore, and her fleet was unbeaten. On the other hand, Alexander had already learned much by the siege of the citadel of Halicarnassus. He had gathered to himself a corps of engineers from Cyprus and Phoenicia. The Sidonian fleet was with him, and presently the king of Cyprus came over to him with 120 ships, which gave him the command of the sea. Moreover, the great Carthage, either relying on the strength of the mother city or being disloyal to her, and being furthermore entangled in a war in Sicily, sent no help. The first measure of Alexander was to build a pier from the mainland to the island, a dam which remains to this day, and on this, as it came close to the walls of Tyre, he set up his towers and battering rams against the walls. He also moored ships in which towers and rams were erected. The Tyrians used fire ships against this flotilla and made sorties from their two harbors in a big surprise raid that they made on the Cyprian ships. They were caught and badly mauled. Many other ships were rammed, and one big galley of 5 banks of oars and one of 4 were captured outright. Finally, a breach in the walls was made, and the Macedonians, clambering up the debris from their ships, stormed the city. The siege had lasted 7 months. Gaza held out for 2. In each case, there was a massacre, the plundering of the city, and the selling of the survivors into slavery. Then, towards the end of 332 BCE, Alexander entered Egypt, and the command of the sea was assured Greece, which, all this while, had been wavering in its policy, decided now, at last, that it was on the side of Alexander, and the council of the Greek states at Corinth voted its captain general a golden crown of victory. From this time onward, the Greeks were with the Macedonians. The Egyptians also were with the Macedonians, but they had been for Alexander from the beginning. They had lived under Persian rule for nearly 200 years, and the coming of Alexander meant for them only a change of masters. On the whole, a change for the better. The country surrendered without a blow. Alexander treated its religious feelings with extreme respect. He unwrapped no mummies, as Cambyses had done, and took no liberties with Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis. Hopefully not doing the thing that I've talked was done by some groups in India. Here, in great temples, and upon a vast scale, Alexander found the evidences of a religiosity, mysterious and irrational, to remind him of the secrets and mysteries that had entertained his mother and impressed his childhood. During his 4 months in Egypt, he flirted with religious emotions. He was still a very young man, we must remember, divided against himself. The strong sanity he inherited from his mother had made him a great soldier. The teaching of Aristotle had given him something of the scientific outlook upon the world. He had destroyed Tyre and Egypt at one of the mouths of the Nile. He now founded a new city, Alexandria, to replace that ancient center of trade. To the north of Tyre, near Issus, he founded a second port, Alexandretta. Both of these cities flourish to this day, and for a time Alexandria was perhaps the greatest city in the world. The sites, therefore, must have been wisely chosen, but also Alexander had the unstable emotional imaginativeness of his mother, and side by side with such creative work, he indulged in religious adventures. The gods of Egypt took possession of his mind. He traveled 400 miles to the remote oasis of the Oracle of Ammon. He wanted to settle certain doubts about his true parentage. His mother had inflamed his mind by hints and vague speeches of some deep mystery about his parentage. Well, if both parents were involved in the cult, then, might have been some sort of magical process involved. Was so ordinary a human being as Philip of Macedon really his father? For nearly 400 years, Egypt had been a country politically contemptible, overrun now by Ethiopians, now by Assyrians, now by Babylonians, now by Persians. As the indignities of the present became more and more disagreeable to contemplate, the past and the other world became more splendid to Egyptian eyes. It is from festering humiliations of peoples that arrogant religious propagandists bring. To the triumphant, the downtrodden can say, "It is not in the sight of the true gods." So the son of Philip of Macedon, the master general of Greece, was made to feel a small person amidst the gigantic temples, and he had an abnormal share of youth's normal ambition to impress everybody. How gratifying, then, for him to discover presently that he was no mere successful mortal. Not one of these modern, vulgar, Greekish folk, but ancient and divine, the son of a god, the pharaoh god, son of Amun-Ra. Already in the previous chapter, we have given a description of that encounter in the desert temple. Not altogether was the young man convinced. He had his moments of conviction, he had his saner phases, when the thing was almost a jest. In the presence of Macedonians and Greeks, he doubted if he was divine. When it thundered loudly, the ribald Aristarchus could ask him, "Won't you do something of the sort, O son of Zeus?" But the crazy notion was, nevertheless, present henceforth in his brain, ready to be inflamed by wine or flattery. Next spring, 331 BCE, he returned to Tyre and marched thence round towards Assyria, leaving the Syrian desert on his right, near the ruins of forgotten Nineveh. He found a great Persian army that had been gathering since the battle of Issus awaiting him. It was another huge medley of contingents, and it relied for its chief force upon that now antiquated weapon, the warrior chariot. Of these, Darius had a force of 200, and each chariot had scythes attached to its wheels and to the pole and body of the chariot. There seemed to have been 4 horses to each chariot, and it will be obvious that if one of those horses was wounded by javelin or arrow, that chariot was held up. The outer horses acted chiefly as buffers for the inner wheel horses. They were hitched to the chariot by a single outside trace, which could be easily cut away, but the loss of one of the wheel horses completely incapacitated the whole affair. Against broken footmen or a crowd of individualist fighters, such vehicles might be formidable. But Darius began the battle by flinging them against the cavalry and light infantry. Few reached their objective, and those that did were readily disposed of. There was some maneuvering for position. The well-drilled Macedonians moved obliquely across the Persian front, keeping good order. The Persians, following this movement to the flank, opened gaps in their array. Then suddenly, the disciplined Macedonian cavalry charged at one of these torn places and smote the center of the Persian host. The infantry followed close upon their charge. The center and left of the Persians crumpled up. For a while, the light cavalry on the Persian right gained ground against Alexander's left, only to be cut to pieces by the cavalry from Thessaly, which by this time had become almost as good as its Macedonian model. The Persian forces ceased to resemble an army. They dissolved into a vast multitude of fugitives, streaming under great dust clouds, and without a single rally across the hot plain towards Arbela. Through the dust and the flying crowd rode the victors, slaying and slaying until darkness stayed the slaughter. Darius led the retreat. Such was the Battle of Arbela. It was fought on October the 1st, 331 BCE. We know its date so exactly because it is recorded that 11 days before it began, the soothsayers on both sides had been greatly exercised by an eclipse of the moon. Darius fled to the north, into the country of the Medes. Alexander marched on to Babylon, the ancient city of Hammurabi. Hammurabi had reigned 1700 years before, and of Nebuchadnezzar the Great, and of Nabonidus, was still, unlike Nineveh, a prosperous and important center. Like the Egyptians, the Babylonians were not greatly concerned at a change of rule to Macedonian from Persian. The temple of Bel Marduk was in ruins, a quarry for building material, but the tradition of the Chaldean priests still lingered, and Alexander promised to restore the building. Well, there was different periods of Zoroastrian revival, right? Thence he marched on to Susa, once the chief city of the vanished and forgotten Elamites, and now the Persian capital. He went on to Persepolis, where as the climax of a drunken carouse, he burnt down the great palace of the King of Kings. This, he afterwards declared, was the revenge of Greece for the burning of Athens by Xerxes. Section 4. And now begins a new phase in the story of Alexander. For the next 7 years he wandered with an army chiefly of Macedonians in the north and east of what was then known the known world. At first it was a pursuit of Darius. Afterwards it became, was it a systematic survey of a world he meant to consolidate into one great order, or was it a wild goose chase? His own soldiers, his own intimates, though the latter, and at last stayed his career beyond the Indus. On the map it looks very like a wild goose chase. It seems to aim at nothing in particular and to get nowhere. The pursuit of Darius III soon came to a pitiful end. After the battle of Arbela, his own generals seemed to have revolted against his weakness and incompetence. They made him a prisoner and took him with them in spite of his desire to throw himself upon the generosity of his conqueror, Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. They made their leader. There was at last a hot and exciting chase of the flying caravan which conveyed the captive King of Kings. At dawn, after an all-night pursuit, it was sighted far ahead. The flight became a headlong bolt. Baggage, women, everything was abandoned by Bessus and his captains, and one other impediment also they left behind. By the side of a pool of water far away from the road, a Macedonian trooper presently found a deserted mule cart with its mules still in the traces. In this cart lay Darius, stabbed in a score of places and bleeding to death. He had refused to go on with Bessus, refused to mount the horse that was brought to him, so his captains had run him through with their spears and left him. He asked his captors for water. What else he may have said, we do not know. The historians have seen fit to fabricate a quite impossible last dying speech for him. Probably he said very little. When a little after sunrise Alexander came up, Darius was already dead. To the historian of the world, the wanderings of Alexander have an interest of their own quite apart from the light they throw upon his character, just as the campaign of Darius I lifted the curtain behind Greece and Macedonia and showed us something of the silent background to the north of the audible and recorded history of the early civilizations. So now Alexander's campaigns take us into regions about which there had hitherto been no trustworthy record made. We discover they were not desert regions, but full of a gathering life of their own. He marched to the shores of the Caspian, thence he traveled eastward across what is now called western Turkestan. He founded a city that is known as Herat, whence he went northward by Kabul and by what is now Samarkand, right up to the mountains of central Turkestan. He returned southward and came down into India by the Khyber Pass. He fought a great battle on the upper Indus against a very tall and chivalrous king, Porus, in which the Macedonian infantry encountered an array of elephants and defeated them. Possibly he would have pushed eastward across the deserts to the Ganges Valley, but his troops refused to go further. Possibly they had not done so, then or later he would have gone on until he vanished eastward out of history. But he was forced to turn about. He built a fleet and descended to the mouth of the Indus. There he divided his forces. The main army he took along the desolate coast back to the Persian Gulf, and on the way it suffered dreadfully and lost many men through thirst. The fleet followed him by sea and rejoined him at the entrance to the Persian Gulf. In the course of this 6-year tour he fought battles, received the submission of many strange peoples, and founded cities. He saw the dead body of Darius in June 330 BCE. He returned to Susa in 324 BCE. He found the empire in disorder, the provincial satraps raising armies of their own, Bactria and Media in insurrection, and Olympias making government impossible in Macedonia. Harpalus, the royal treasure, had bolted with all that was portable of the royal treasure, and was making his way, bribing as he went, towards Greece. Some of the Harpalus money is said to have reached Demosthenes. But before we deal with the closing chapter of the story of Alexander, let us say a word or so about these northern regions into which he wandered. It is evident that from the Danube region, right across South Russia, right across the country to the north of the Caspian, right across the country to the east of the Caspian, as far as the mountain masses of the Pamir Plateau, and eastward into the Tarim Basin of eastern Turkestan, there spread then a series of similar barbaric tribes and peoples, all at about the same stage of culture, and for the most part Aryan in their language and possibly Nordic in their race. They had a few cities. Mostly they were nomadic. At times they settled temporarily to cultivate the land. They were certainly already mingling in Central Asia with the Mongolian tribes, but the Mongolian tribes were not then prevalent there. An immense process of drying up and elevation has been going on in these parts of the world during the last 10,000 years. 10,000 years ago, there was probably a continuous water barrier between the basin of the Obi and the Ural-Caspian Sea. As this had dried up and the marshy land had become steppe-like country, Nordic nomads from the west and Mongolian nomads from the east had met and mixed, and the riding horse had come back into the Western world. It is evident this great stretch of country was becoming a region of accumulation for these barbaric peoples. They were very loosely attached to the lands they occupied. They lived in tents and wagons rather than in houses. A brief cycle of plentiful and healthy years are a cessation of tribal warfare under some strong ruler would lead to considerable increases of population. Then 2 or 3 hard years would suffice to send the tribes wandering again in search of food. Alexander the Great, silver coin of Lysimachus, 321 to 281 BCE, and, well, they're called barbarians because of the language difference, but, you have that Horn of Amun Roth bit. But yeah, call me old-fashioned, not wanting to call people barbarians because just they speak a different language. Or maybe they're not as cruel as the Greeks, so that civilized people will kill the children and torture people and whatnot. It's like, wait, what? You know, from before the dawn of recorded history, this region of human accumulation between the Danube and China had been, as it were, intermittently raining out tribes southward and westward. It was like a cloud bank behind the settled landscape that accumulated and then precipitated invaders. We have noted how the Celtic peoples drizzled westward and how the Italians, the Greeks, and their Epirote, Macedonian, and Phrygian kindred came south. We have noted, too, that the Cimmerian drive from the east, like a sudden driving shower of barbarians across Asia Minor, the southward coming out of the Scythians and Medes and Persians and the Aryan descent into India. About a century before Alexander, there had been a fresh Aryan invasion of Italy by a Celtic people, the Gauls, who had settled in the valley of the Po. Those various races came down out of their northern obscurity into the light of history, and meanwhile, beyond that light, the reservoir accumulated for fresh discharges. Alexander's march in Central Asia brings now into our history names that are fresh to us. The Parthians, a race of mountain bowmen who were destined to play an important role in history a century or so later, and the Bactrians, who lived in the sandy native land of the camel. You know, pretty close to the Afghanis. Because I don't think Bactria is exactly the same thing as modern Afghanistan, but it contains part of it. Everywhere he seems to have met Aryan-speaking peoples. The Mongolian barbarians to the northeastward were still unsuspected. No one imagined there was yet another great cloud bank of population beyond the Scythians and their kind in the north of China that was presently also to begin a drift westward and southward, mixing as it came with the Nordic Scythians and every other people of kindred habits that it encountered. As yet, only China knew of the Huns. There were no Turks in western Turkestan or anywhere else then, no Tartars in the world. This glimpse of the state of affairs in Turkestan in the 4th century BCE is one of the most interesting aspects of the wanderings of Alexander. Another is his raid through the Punjab. From the point of view of the teller of the human story, it is provocative that he did not go on into the Ganges country, and that consequently we have no independent accounts by Greek writers of the life in ancient Bengal. But there is a considerable literature in various Indian languages dealing with Indian history and social life that still needs to be made accessible to European readers. Section 5. Alexander had been in undisputed possession of the Persian Empire for 6 years. He was now 31. In those 6 years, he had created very little. He had retained most of the organization of the Persian provinces, appointing fresh satraps or retaining the former ones. The roads, the ports, the organization of the empire were still as Cyrus, his great predecessor, had left them. In Egypt, he had merely replaced old provincial governors by new ones. In India, he had defeated Porus, and then left him in power much as he had found him, except that Porus was now called a satrap by the Greeks. Alexander had, it is true, planned out a number of towns, and some of them were to grow into great towns. 17 Alexandrias he founded altogether. Their names have undergone various changes. For example, Kandahar, Iskender, and Secunderabad. But he had destroyed Tyre, and with Tyre, the security of the sea routes, which had hitherto been the chief westward outlet for Mesopotamia. Historians say that he Hellenized the east, but Babylonia and Egypt swarmed with Greeks before his time. He was not the cause. He was a part of the Hellenization. For a time, the whole world, from the Adriatic to the Indus, was under one ruler, so far as he had realized the dreams of Isocrates and Philip his father. But how far he was in making this a permanent and enduring union. How far was he in making this a permanent and enduring union? How far as yet was it anything more than a dazzling but transitory flourish of his own magnificent self? He was making no great roads, setting up no sure sea communions. It is idle to accuse him of leaving education alone, because the idea that empires must be cemented by education was still foreign to human thought, but he was forming no group of statesmen about him. He was thinking of no successor. He was creating no tradition. Nothing more than a personal legend. The idea that the world would have to go on after Alexander engaged in any other employment than the discussion of his magnificence seems to have been outside his mental range. He was still young, it is true, but well before Philip was 31, he had been thinking of the education of Alexander. Was Alexander a statesman at all? Some students of his career assure us that he was, and now at Susa, he planned a mighty world empire, seeing it not simply as a Macedonian conquest of the world, but as a melting together of racial traditions. He did one thing at any rate that gives color to this idea. He held a great marriage feast in which he and 90 of his generals and friends were married to Persian brides. He himself married a daughter of Darius, though already he possessed an Asiatic wife in Roxana, the daughter of the king of Samarkand. This wholesale wedding was made a very splendid festival, and at the same time all of his Macedonian soldiers, to the number of several thousands who had married Asiatic brides, were given wedding gifts. This has been called the marriage of Europe and Asia. The two continents were to be joined, wrote Plutarch, in lawful wedlock, and by community of offspring. And next he began to train recruits from Persia and the north, Parthians, Bactrians, and the like, in the distinctive disciplines of the phalanx and the cavalry. Was that also to assimilate Europe and Asia, or was it to make himself independent of his Macedonians? They thought the latter, at any rate, and mutinied, and it was with some difficulty that he brought them to a penitent mood and induced them to take part in common feast with the Persians. The historians have made a long and eloquent speech for him on this occasion, but the gist of it was that he bade his Macedonians begone and gave no sign of how he proposed that they should get home out of Persia. After 3 days of dismay, they submitted to him and begged his forgiveness. Here is the matter for a very pretty discussion. Was Alexander really planning a racial fusion, or had he just fallen in love with the pomp and divinity of an Oriental monarch, and wished to get rid of these Europeans to whom he was only a king leader? The writers of his own time, those who lived near to his time, lean very much to the latter alternative. They insist upon his immense vanity, how he began to wear the robes and tiara of a Persian monarch, at first only before the barbarians and privately, but afterwards he came to wear it in public when he sat for the dispatch of business, and presently he demanded Oriental prostrations from his friends. One thing seems to support the suggestion of a great personal vanity in Alexander. His portrait was painted and sculptured frequently, and always he is represented as a beautiful youth with wonderful locks flowing backward from a broad forehead. Previously, most men had worn beards, but Alexander, enamored of his youthful loveliness, would not part with it. He remained a sham boy at 32. He shaved his face, and so set a fashion in Greece and Italy that lasted many centuries. Well, the shaving of the face is also associated with fascism, so the stories of violence and vanity in his closing years cluster thick upon his memory. He listened to tittle-tattle about Philotas, the son of Parmenio, one of his most trusted and faithful generals. Philotas, it was said, had boasted to some woman he was making love, that Alexander was a mere boy. That, but for such men as his father and himself, there would have been no conquest of Persia and the like. Such assertions had a certain element of truth in them. The woman was brought to Alexander, who listened to her treacheries. Presently, Philotas was accused of conspiracy, and upon very insufficient evidence, tortured and executed. Then Alexander thought of Parmenio, whose other 2 sons had died for him in battle. He sent swift messengers to assassinate the old man before he could hear of his son's death. Now Parmenio had been one of the most trusted of Philip's generals. It was Parmenio who had led the Macedonian armies into Asia for the murder of Philip. There can be little doubt of the substantial truth of this story, nor about the execution of Clisthenes, the nephew of Aristotle, who refused Alexander divine honors and went about with as much pride as if he had demolished a tyranny, while the young men followed him as the only freeman among thousands. Mixed with such incidents, we have the very illuminating story of the drunken quarrel in which he killed Clitus. The monarch and his company had been drinking hard, and the drink had made the talk loud and free. There was much flattery of the young god, much detraction of Philip, at which Alexander had smiled with satisfaction. This drunken self-complacency was more than the Macedonians could stand. It roused Clitus with his foster brother to a frenzy. Clitus reproached Alexander with his Median costume and praised Philip. There was a loud quarrel, and to end it, Clitus was hustled out of the room by his friends. He was, however, in the obstinate phase of drunkenness, and he returned by another entrance. He was heard outside quoting Euripides in a bold and disrespectful tone. "Are these your customs? Is it thus that Greece rewards her combatants? Shall one man claim the trophies won by thousands?" Whereupon Alexander snatched a spear from one of his guards and ran Clitus through the body as he lifted the curtain to come in. One is forced to believe that this was the real atmosphere of the young conqueror's life. Then the story of his frantic and cruel display of grief for Hephaestion can scarcely be all invention. If it is true, or in any part true, it displays a mind ill-balanced and altogether wrapped up in personal things, to whom empire was no more than opportunity for egoistic display, and all the resources of the world stuff for freaks of that sort of generosity which robs 1,000 people to extort the admiration of one astounded recipient. Hephaestion, being ill, was put upon a strict diet, but in the absence of his physician at the theatre, he ate a roasted fowl and drank a flagon of iced wine, in consequence of which he died. Thereupon Alexander decided upon a display of grief. It was the grief of a lunatic. He had the physician crucified. He ordered every horse and mule in Persia to be shorn, and pulled down the battlements of the neighboring cities. He prohibited all music in his camp for a long time, and having taken certain villages of the Kassans, he caused all the adults to be massacred as a sacrifice to the manes of Hephaestion. Finally, he set aside no less than 10,000 talents for a tomb. For those days this was an enormous sum of money, none of which things did any real honor to Hephaestion, but they served to demonstrate to an awe-stricken world what a tremendous thing the sorrow of Alexander could be. This last story, and many such stories, may be lies or distortions or exaggerations, but they have a vein in common. After a bout of hard drinking in Babylon, a sudden fever came upon Alexander, 323 BCE. And he sickened and died. He was still only 33 years of age. Forthwith, the world empire he had snatched at and held in his hands as a child, might snatch at and hold the precious volumes, fell to the ground and was shattered in pieces. So we have the breakup of the empire of Alexander at the close of the 4th century BCE. And all sounds. Oh, I guess it's not. Thought for a second there was going to be a place to have another section here, but we'll have another map, a further stage in the breakup of Alexander's empire in the first half of the 3rd century BCE. And we have a tetragrammaton here with the head of Seleucus I. Whatever appearance of a worldwide order may have gleamed upon men's imaginations, vanished at his death. The story becomes the story of a barbaric autocracy and confusion. Everywhere the provincial rulers set up for themselves. In the course of a few years, the entire family of Alexander had been destroyed. Roxana, his barbarian wife, was prompt to murder as a rival, the daughter of Darius. She herself presently bore Alexander a posthumous son, who was also called Alexander. He was murdered with her a few years later, 311 BCE. Hercules, the only other son of Alexander, was murdered also. So too was Ardadas, the weak-minded half-brother. See Section 2. Plutarch gives a last glimpse of Olympias during a brief interval of power in Macedonia, accusing first this person and then that of poisoning her wonderful son. Many she killed in her fury. The bodies of some of his circle who had died after his death she caused to be dug up, but we do not know if any fresh light was shed upon his death by these disinterments. Finally, Olympias was killed in Macedonia by the friends of those she had slain. Section 6. From this welter of crime there presently emerged 3 leading figures. Much of the old Persian Empire, as far as the Indus eastward and almost to Lydia in the west, was held by one general, Seleucus, who founded a dynasty, the Seleucid dynasty. Macedonia fell to another Macedonian general, Antigonus. A third Macedonian, Ptolemy, secured Egypt, and making Alexandria his chief city, established a sufficient naval ascendancy. to keep also Cyprus and most of the coast of Phoenicia and Asia Minor. Remember, Asia Minor was just like one little area in the references at that time. And hundreds of years later, Asia wasn't spoken of as the continent. The Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires lasted for a considerable time. The forms of government in Asia Minor and the Balkans were more unstable. Two maps will help the reader to a sense of the kaleidoscopic nature of the political boundaries of the 3rd century BCE. Antigonus was defeated and killed at the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BCE, leaving Lysimachus, the governor of Thrace, and Cassander of Macedonia and Greece as equally transitory successors. Minor governors carved out smaller states. Meanwhile, the barbarians swung down into the broken up and enfeebled world of civilization from the west and from the east. From the west came the Gauls, a people closely related to the Celts. They raided down through Macedonia and Greece to Delphi, 279 BCE, and two sections of them crossed the Bosphorus into Asia Minor, being first employed as mercenaries and then setting up for themselves as independent plunderers, and after raiding almost to the Taurus, they settled in the old Phrygian land, holding the people about them to tribute. These Gauls of Phrygia became the Galatians of St. Paul's epistle. Armenia and the southern shores of the Black Sea became a confusion of changing rulers. Kings with Hellenistic ideas appeared in Cappadocia and Pontus, the south shore of the Black Sea, in Bithynia, and in Pergamum. From the east, the Scythians and the Parthians and the Bactrians also drove southward. For a time, there were Greek-ruled Bactrian states, becoming more and more orientalized. In the 2nd century BCE, Greek adventurers from Bactria raided down into North India and founded short-lived kingdoms there. The last eastward fling of the Greek, and then gradually barbarism fell again like a curtain between the Western civilizations and India. Section 7. Amidst all these shattered fragments of the burst bubble of Hellenic Empire, one small state stands out and demands at least a brief section to itself, the kingdom of Pergamum. We hear first of this town as an independent center during the struggle that ended in the Battle of Ipsus, while the tide of Gaulish invasion swirled and foamed to and fro in Asia Minor between the years 277 and 241 BCE. Pergamum for a time paid the Gauls tribute, but she retained her general independence, and at last, under Attalus I, refused her tribute and defeated them in 2 decisive battles. For more than a century thereafter, until 131 BCE, Pergamum remained free and was, perhaps during that period, the most highly civilized state in the world. On the hill of the Acropolis was reared a rich group of buildings, palaces, temples, a museum, and a library, rivals of those Alexandria, of which we shall presently tell, and almost the first in the world. Under the princes of Pergamum, Greek art blossomed afresh, and the reliefs of the altar of the temple of Zeus and the statues of fighting and dying Gauls, which were made there, are among the artistic treasures of mankind. In a little while, as we shall tell later, the influence of a new power began to be felt in the eastern Mediterranean, the power of the Roman Republic, friendly to Greece and to Greek civilization, and in this power the Hellenic communities of Pergamum and Rhodes found a natural and useful ally and supporter against the Galatians and against the Orientalized Seleucid Empire. We shall relate how at last the Roman power came to Asia, how it defeated the Seleucid Empire at the Battle of Magnesia, 190 BCE, and drove it out of Asia Minor and beyond the Taurus mountains, and how it finally, in 131 BCE, Attalus III, the last king of Pergamum, bowing to his sense of an inevitable destiny, made the Roman Republic the heir to his kingdom, which became then the Roman province of Asia. 8. Nearly all historians are disposed to regard the career of Alexander the Great as marking an epoch in human affairs. It drew together all the known world, excepting only the Western Mediterranean, into one drama. But the opinions men have formed of Alexander himself vary enormously. They fall, most of them, into 2 main schools. One type of scholar is fascinated by the youth and splendor of this young man. These Alexander worshippers seem disposed to take him at his own valuation, to condone every crime and folly, either as the mere ebullience of a rich nature are as the bitter necessity to some gigantic scheme, and to regard his life as framed upon a scheme of statesmanship, such as all the wider knowledge and wider ideas of these latter times barely suffice to bring into the scope of our understanding. On the other hand, there are those who see him only as a wrecker of the slowly maturing possibilities of a free and tranquil Hellenized world, for we ascribe to Alexander or to his father Philip schemes of world policy such as a 20th century historian philosopher might approve. We shall do well to consider very carefully the utmost range of knowledge and thought that was possible in those days. The world of Plato, Isocrates, and Aristotle had practically no historical perspective at all. There had not been such a thing as history in the world, history, that is, as distinguished from mere priestly chronicles, until the last couple of centuries. Even highly educated men had the most circumscribed ideas of geography and geographies. For most men, the world was still flat and limitless. The only systematic political philosophy was based on the experiences of minute city-states, and took no thought of empires. Nobody knew anything of the origins of civilization. No one had speculated upon economics before that time. No one had worked out the reaction of one social class upon another. We are too apt to consider the career of Alexander as the crown of some process that had long been afoot, as the climax of a crescendo. In a sense, no doubt, it was that, but much more true is it that it was not so much an end as beginning. It was the first revelation to the human imagination of the oneness of human affairs. The utmost reach of the thought of Greece before his time was of a Persian empire, Hellenized, a predominance in the world of Macedonians and Greeks. But before Alexander was dead, and much more after he was dead, and there had been time to think him over, the conception of a world law and organization was a practicable and assimilable idea for the minds of men. For some generations, Alexander the Great was for mankind the symbol and embodiment of world order and world dominion. He became a fabulous being, his head adorned with the divine symbols of the demigod Hercules, or the god Amun-Ra, appears on the coins of such among his successors as could claim to be his heirs. Then the idea of world dominion was taken up by another great people, a people who for some centuries exhibited considerable political genius, the Romans, and the figure of another conspicuous adventurer, Caesar, eclipsed for the western half of the old world the figure of Alexander. So by the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, we find already arisen in the Western civilization of the old world 3 of the great structural ideas that rule the mind of contemporary mankind. We have already traced the escape of writing and knowledge from the secrets and mysteries and initiations of the old world priesthoods, and the development of the idea of a universal knowledge, of a universally understandable and communicable history and philosophy. We have taken the figures of Herodotus and Aristotle as typical exponents of this first great idea, the idea of science, using the word science in its widest and properest sense to include history and signify a clear vision of man in relation to the things about him. We have traced also the generalization of religion among the Babylonians, Jews, and other Semitic peoples, from the dark worship in temples and consecrated places of some local or tribal god, to the open service of one universal God of righteousness, whose temple is the whole world. And now we have traced also the first germination of the idea of a world policy. Again, what about what the Indians and the Persians said before that? And the Persians thought of Alexander as the great destroyer of, their religious records and stuff, It wasn't just the kings went and came, The rest of the history of mankind is very largely the history of those 3 ideas of science, of universal righteousness, and of a human common weal spreading out from the minds of the rare and exceptional persons and peoples in which they first originated into the general consciousness of the race, and giving first a new color, then a new spirit, and then a new direction to human affairs.